Hi, and welcome to today's Good e-learning webinar, Integrating DevSecOps Team, delivered by Mark Peters. So, who are Good e-learning? Well, Good e-learning provide expert training to individuals and large-scale organizations around the world. We are a market-leading specialist in creating high-quality and affordable online training. We don't just stop with e-learning, we also virtual classrooms, coaching as well. So we provide a plethora of online training services. We're a multi-award-winning corporate provider with years of experience and passionate about training and only work with leading industry experts from around the globe, like Mark Peters, who today is going to deliver our webinar for us. So I'm going to stop talking and I'll hand over to Mark.
Hey, good day. I'm Dr. Mark Peters. I'm here today to talk about integrating your DevSecOps teams, finding ways that you can look at your teams and your organization to identify the security challenges you have, and getting that team integrated to provide a full DevSecOps organization. Finding a way forward if you're struggling today to make ways to integrate those teams through dev, operations, and security, and integrate that team for success throughout your entire environment. I'm product manager at BrainGoo. I've worked for several years on different Department of Defense DevOps integrations, as well as being a DevOps ambassador. Although a recent DevOps devotee in the past 3 years, I worked DevOps in the military for a number of years before that, spending over 22 years doing intelligence. I have a doctorate in strategic security, and I'm a doctoral candidate for Capella in looking at information technology. I also authored Cashing In on Cyber Power, analyzing 10 years of cyber attack. I'm looking for ways to bring teams together and accelerate your value. In some of my spare time, I like to draw, I like to read. Sometimes I like to speak, and I do judo as well as having 2 great dogs, Great Danes. But with that, that's enough about me, and we'll move forward into the presentation. When you look at your teams and you've done your DevOps transformation, does this feel like your org chart? Is there a mess of stuff all over the place and you just don't know how to put it together? You can't find ways to integrate those users. You can't find ways to integrate the different teams, and everything struggles. If you're in this kind of layout in a fractal pattern, we can help you today. We can help you find some basic rules and some basic guidelines to drive you forward. Do you need to get to here or back to here? Do you have your management integrating with your Sec, Dev, and Ops teams and then contributing to the users? Or have you skipped that stage entirely and you're just going from management to users, and DevSecOps is outside of that spectrum? You need to align for value and make sure that you realign for your value in your process. Having a good organization and a good smooth team is one of those first keys to success. Knowing where your different parts are integrated and knowing how those elements are going to talk to each other and how they have communication to value that interaction over the planning as part of our core agile concepts. There's 3 ways in DevOps, and we talk about the 3 ways, and we integrate those 3 ways back to security. Of course, we should know, or if you don't know, we'll go back over them. The 3 ways are flow, feedback, and continuous experimentation. Flow makes sure that we move as fast as possible, that we remove constraints. When we do this with security, we work to make sure that security doesn't constrain our workflow, that we're not just handing things over to security, and that security isn't working in a different department, in a different area where we can't integrate with them. We try to shift our security testing left and automate. We try to use security libraries that are there, thinking about our value stream, and creating mutual accountability. We have to emphasize this because too often what happens with security is we see that 10 years ago, we had a great network analyst. And because that analyst was great, we moved him from working on the keyboard to working in the compliance environment. This meant they left some of their training behind. They weren't working on the keyboard, and they're no longer familiar with our cloud native implementation. They haven't looked at containers, they haven't looked at Kubernetes, and they're not experienced. We want to take those individuals and move them back to the team to get them enough experience where they know what's going on, they know how the processes work, and they can integrate those things together. If they're capable of integrating those things, that enables our second way of feedback. We ensure that fast feedback by automating security testing. Rather than having our security teams do the testing separately and contain it in their own library, in their own system, in their own file, where it's not visible and observable, we break it open to everyone. We let all the developers and all the operators see what we're doing for security testing. We include security in our product demos. We show how we have access and authentication in the products we deliver so that we know about security. And we build that peer-to-peer conversation moving security down into the teams so that the teams that don't understand security or don't understand the value of security can talk more about it and can talk honestly about it. We build the telemetry and observability into our platforms so we can see what's going on. We know all the processes. We know how different apps are communicating to each other, how microservices are communicating out to our containers, and how we orchestrate, and that our security understands that orchestration as well as our developers, so we can build security throughout the process. The third way is we get to continuous experimentation and learning. We ensure that cross-skilling we talked about, making sure that our security engineers and our security experts are up to speed on our new development tools, and that our developers are up to speed on what we need for security, on what our compliance standards are, whether it's a GDPR for European settings, whether it's a HIPAA in the US for healthcare, whether it's that payment card industry data security standard, the PCI DSS, as well as working with the latest in ISO and NIST tools to make sure that we have the right compliance standards in place. If we don't have the standard or we're not sure of the standard, we experiment to find ways to get there. We allocate that time and our processes to work together, ensuring that we document and share all experiences, both good and bad, so we can talk about where we've made security successes and security failures, as well as developmental successes and developmental failures. First off, when we start integrating, we need to put the problem on the table. Like I said, security teams are used to separation. They're used to working in their own section differently, to getting something handed off to them, and then having a set amount of time to work on it. We can't do that with DevSecOps. We have to increase the flow and remove the constraints. We need to bring those folks back to that same team, back to the integration that they talk about so they can work together. We need to think about the integration parameters they use. We need to think about where the standards are, how we manage risk across the board, or whether we just buy a solution from someone else and let them implement the security for us and use those tools from either an open source or a licensed vendor to move the products forward. A great example being able to put this security on the table is one I had with one of my development teams. We switched them over to DevSecOps. They had security and they said, we know the security, we understand what this DevSecOps is. 2 days into the process, they came back to me and they said, we figured this out. We shifted all of our security left and we don't have a problem anymore. I said, great, that's awesome. I'm really excited that you managed to integrate so quickly. Show me what you're doing. And they showed me, they had the scanner, they built the scanner into their CI/CD pipeline for DevOps, and they were running the scanner. I said, all right, let's talk about the results. Let's talk about mitigating some of those risks we get from the scanner. And I got a blank look. And the reason I got a blank look is they set their security in their GitLab run. It's true. That meant that every time the security ran, or the security test ran, it passed the pipeline. I said, well, where are the logs? They said, oh, we turned the logs off. We just ran the security. That's all we need to do, right? So sometimes there's more conversation. That's part of that feedback loop in getting the information back to the folks. To succeed from that, to move forward, not to leave you with a half a story, we built a difference tool for them, one that would show the difference between their baseline and the security tests they were running today, so that they could know if they were adding vulnerabilities or removing vulnerabilities as they moved it forward, to best measure the value. When we consider security, we consider two phases. Security exists to guard our value or to signal a threat. We build security in its protection to say that something doesn't happen. We build in the access and authentication so that you have to have the right passwords and the right keys to get into the products that we need to be secure, to get into the data that we need to be secure. And then we build security around the outside, around the attack surfaces of our development, so that we signal a threat. When we decide to implement security, we have to decide what we want it to do for us and where we want it to do those things. Security does matter, and we have to have it as part of the value stream. But the best way to use security is just like in DevOps. We do that minimum viable product first. We build the smallest element of security, and then we continue to work from there until we have it where we want in that end state. We have to get together with those teams and decide which security matters and to whom. If we don't decide what matters first, then we're kind of lost on our development. We don't have good feedback and we don't have good flow. And we can't experiment because we don't know where we want to go in the next step. When we map that interaction for security, we go back to a basic process. We look at the things that are parts of the problem and figure out how to look at those problems. In general, at a very high level, there are 3 different aspects of interaction. There's simple interaction. If I have 2 apples and I get 2 more apples, I get 4 apples every time. It works the same. This is a simple problem. If we just add to it or subtract to it, we know exactly what happens. We have one factor on each side. When we move into a complicated problem, there's more issue involved. If I buy 2 more apples, I have $2 less in my pocket, but there's 2 apples less in the store inventory. And if I'm managing all those aspects, those are different problems that I have to solve in a different way, but they still have a fairly straightforward and straight line answer. From there, we move to the complex problem, or the Gordian knot. This is where every issue is tied to every other issue. If you think about a big ball of yarn, when you pull on one string, you don't always know what strings it will pull on, and you don't know how it will interact. If we get too complicated, we run into these types of problems. We don't know how changing security will affect development. We don't know how changing security will affect our product. We don't know how changing the product will affect our security. We have to make sure that we break these problems down into the smallest element possible so that we can address these problems. What we see in this, in our actual implementation in the business environment, is that we have personal preferences for security. We have people who've done things before and they want to continue to do it the same way. And we need to change some of those preferences so that they're more aligned with the modern security we need and the modern implementations we need to use. We have functional interactions between the teams. If we're running a cloud native team, we might have something in Kubernetes or Helm or Docker using containers that works differently with the hypervisor and the orchestration system, that works differently with our microservices and our service mesh. We have to integrate all those pieces together. And then we have to make sure that they align those corporate guardrails that we have for compliance. What are those basic standards we have to use? We build all those features together and find out where we interact so that we can map our problems and figure out what the problem is and what's the simplest and easiest way to deliver that minimum viable product to get to the next step. We can see more of these basics on interaction as well. We can see dependent or independent interactions based on how we work with each other. When we talk about dependency, we talk about heating a pot of water raises the temperature. A simple problem, we have a 1-for-1. If we change one factor, the other factor changes in a known way or at a known rate. Then we have independent problems where heating the water never changes our refrigerator temp. They don't interact, but they still might be a problem that we have to address. If changing our development doesn't affect how we implement security and we haven't built the security in, then we can't make changes to the security with development, which is where we want to be. We want to move to an interdependent practice where everything talks to each other and relies on each other. This lets us become resilient, even with those complex interactions, because we've built a plan for all the various ways that things can talk to each other and all the various ways that they can provide security and provide functionality. These tend to be nonlinear with less predictable outcomes, which is why we need to talk and we need to interact on a regular basis. Every element we have ties to our outcome, ties to our ability to deliver value and deliver success. This informs our agile process of people over processes, that the interaction is more important than processes. This doesn't mean that we leave the processes behind, because those processes are equally important in building standard ways that we can move forward to increase the flow. We inform those processes. We think about those processes through our review, our demonstrations, and our retrospectives, and constantly talking about what we're doing and how we're delivering to the next level to create success. When we start with this, we have to start where we are. You can't start at some future state and say, this is where we're going to be. You have to be realistic about it. You have to take an assessment of where you are today and establish a common vocabulary from those teams. One of the things that informs a lot of those teams is the trust algorithm, highlighted in the diagram on the slide. Trust is built from credibility, that people know what they're doing, that they have reliability, that they deliver on a regular basis, and that they have empathy. They actually feel for each other's problems. They don't just say, that's your problem and I'm leaving it behind, but they work together to move that forward. And that's why it's divided by self-interest. We can't be entirely self-interested in our DevSecOps formation. We have to build the processes in a reliable way that lets us move forward. If you don't know where you are, there are some ways that you can find out. You can use surveys and assessments of your teams. You can send out those simple like-art surveys that say, not done to always done. Or you can build focus groups. You can sit the teams down and ask them about what they have and gather the information in a qualitative measure so that you get the best answers possible. You overlay this with your metrics, your repeatable contextual data. If you don't have metrics today, you probably need to find some. But if you do have metrics, you need to think about the metrics you use. And of course, metrics are always changing. We change metrics based on what we want and how we get to the next session. So we take those metrics we have in connection with our surveys and assessments and move those into those sensing sessions, those focus groups that we have to talk together, to talk about what we're getting and what we're not getting, and where maybe some more data would help us be more useful. Like the example I mentioned of the scanner, where the scanner was extremely helpful, but without those logs, that we have a metric or a dashboard to see what we needed. It wasn't really driving us to the place where we needed to be to get to the next step. After we start where we are and we know what that basic is, we have to be able to create a way forward. We have to know from that initial basis where we want to go. And we do that through a shared vision and shared objectives. We know where we want to go in the long term, and we have an idea. And then we map out those objectives to get us there. We can use at this point the value stream mapping techniques as an aspect of Lean to find out what we have, what contributes to our value, and where it goes. As we mentioned, security can either guard or signal, and we have to build in allowances for both guarding and signaling in our metrics discussion and in our way forward, that we're guarding it by building those 2- and 3-way authentication methods so that we can secure it, so we can use multi-factor if needed, so that we can protect the data, and so that we can identify the data. So if we later need to remove it for a different compliance standard like GDPR, we can eliminate those elements of data from it while not breaking the entire system, while leaving things put together, because we understand what the value is and we know how the planning goes. Our basic formation for our DevSecOps pipeline and our DevSecOps and going forward is we move from the backlog to development, to our continuous integration, to delivery, to deployment, and then operation. Each of these stages is going to have their own subset of the value stream and how they contribute value at their place and their location to move forward. Knowing where all these value elements are helps us align the process in the best manner possible so that we can get to the next step. And of course, one of those next steps in part of our trust algorithm is understanding our cultural differences. Culturally and behaviorally, our security and our DevOps environment is different. Security architects and software engineers don't always start out speaking the same language. We have to get them on common terms, and we have to get them to talk together, especially in those early stages of our integration. Traditionally, DevOps is more of an agile framework, and we know that because we have the CALMS metric, right? Cultural, agile, lean, metrics, and sharing are the core of our DevOps and going with their 3 ways. Our security teams, those compliance sections, and those other protection sections, and even in the analysis sections, tend to work on more of a waterfall standard. So we've got to integrate between a horizontal and a vertical. We've got to understand that while DevOps has been more fast-paced, security has been more rigid. That quick sprint cycle goes to a step-by-step approach, that they need to measure everything and measure the attack surface. We need to think about how those 2 things work together and how we can build them to work together. Security often requires multiple lines of approval. One person checks it, another person checks it, it hands off to a compliance engineer or compliance specialist, and then it goes to an auditor who checks it at a different level. We want to take that audit we have in security, that step-by-step and multiple line of approval, and we want to build those requirements down into the DevOps section so that the DevOps individuals understand why we're complying and not merely that we are complying. So they don't see it as a hard constraint, but as something that is important for them to do as they move forward. We see DevOps reacting to those business needs and trying to get out as fast as possible. But we need to make sure that it has safety and security, because security is becoming more and more of a value as we go forward. If we can align these cultural differences, if we can think about the process, we can minimize those differences while we maximize value throughout. One of the ways we can get past those cultural differences is to talk about the crown jewels. What's the most important to our business and what's the most important to our success, both as parts of security and parts of our development. We can talk about what creates the business value for us because we've mapped out that value stream. We understand what our customer wants, but we understand what a customer may not want, but is good for them to have in the meantime. Customers don't always want it slowed down for security, but our first step of security may slow our process slightly, but it's better in the long run and it creates more long-term value. Maybe our crown jewel is proprietary technical code. Maybe we need to keep our code secure. And even though we're using a pre-blessed security library or a pre-blessed repo, we need to move that off to a different section where not everybody can get a hold of that and not everybody can dig into it. Maybe we have practices. Maybe we're better at doing something else than any other company out there, and that's what we want to protect. We don't want to share our practice because we need to protect it. Or maybe it's an elite employee. Maybe there's certain individuals we have that are so good at development that we need to protect them in some manner. Maybe we need to take off their signatures on the items so that another company doesn't recruit them away from us. All these are parts of identifying our exposure, identifying where we're exposing our core path, where we're exposing our business and our intellectual property to other folks. We can use some common metrics to identify these things in our protection. We can use things like deployment frequency, failed deployments, the amount of code committed, lead time, all those standard door metrics. And we can build from those initial metrics to more advanced metrics as we get into it. But the key in having those metrics is being able to tie the telemetry to process, getting actual reports about what we have. When we look at our infrastructure, when we look at our organization, we need to know how things work. We need to know how things work together. I think one of the worst security practices you can have is when we talk about architecture and you build a PowerPoint slide that's 3 months old. That's not the way to go. Every time you log in, especially with a cloud native or another system, you want to be able to know what your architecture is, and you want to be able to know how it works. One of the other tools we use for this is using a standard VM for the developers so that they kick off the same infrastructure every time. And that infrastructure is the same as what we're hoping to use in test and what we're hoping to use in prod, so that things to the early stages are aligned as much as possible, that we find those security problems early through the use of our dashboards and our current and real-time information about our crown jewels to be able to move forward. When we talk about security in those protection metrics, we also want to talk about risk. We want to have a common risk language so that we know what the risks to the business are, whether they're technical, procedural, or personal, and that they can move us forward. When we assess risk, we talk about asset times vulnerability times threat. These can be difficult to get a handle on. They can be difficult to quantify and difficult to assess exactly what they are, which is why it makes good sense to be able to talk together and talk about those risk factors as they drive us forward. We should know how informed we are of our security issues and what's our team's motivation to implement goals. In these excellent surveys from Sonatype, which produces a state of the DevOps every year, we see comparisons between happy developers and grumpy developers, people who aren't happy with the state, who don't have that trust algorithm and haven't integrated together. And we see that those happy developers are more likely to do those security things on a regular basis. They help us do this by evaluating our threats. When we talk about a threat at the basic level, when we're talking about some of those external threats, we talk about the probability of something happening, the intent of someone happening, and the capability of that thing to do harm to us or do harm to our security factor. We evaluate a lot of different sectors, and we see this in a lot of different places. If you remember, just a year or two ago, we had the big SolarWinds hack, where someone got into SolarWinds and they got some malware introduced into it. But the point is that they only had the malware introduced in an earlier stage of the software. If they'd done the patchings like were appropriate, if they'd made all the changes to the newest version because they were aware of what the version changes were and what the patches coming out, it wouldn't have been a problem. And we also know that it wasn't a directed intent, but it was a wide intent to hit a wide area of things with the capability to inject that malware and move us forward or move the attacker forward. But we can block that. We can block that by knowing what the risk is and talking about the risk and whether we move to a new patch or merely stay with the old version. We move from those protection metrics to a consensus. And part of this applies to the cloud native. When we talk about cloud native and containerized, we want to move from what is the CIA, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, to our systems as DIE, distributed, immutable, and ephemeral. We used to always talk about CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, but these apply more often to completed software and completed factors, things that are already done when we look at those things. When we move to the DIE framework, we can look at a step back. We can look at things earlier in the process and things that are more in line with our cloud native and our modern applications. Distributed means we have the system over a wide number of areas. We have it DDoS resistant because you can't hit all those points at one time. Our attack surface is spread out and it distributes those functions. This matches up to the availability of having a distributed system. We see distributed also as having more containers and more surfaces, having those VMs where we can do multiple development so that they're not all open at the same time. We want those containers and those features we deliver to be immutable. Once we deliver code, we don't want it to change. When we deliver the application to our customer, we want to have the same instance in place every time. We don't want them to be able to make changes because when we have it immutable and we know what that solid baseline is, any change that's reported or anyone trying to make that change is going to be reported. It's going to show up on our telemetry and our metrics to drive us forward. Any of those unauthorized changes stand out and we can revert them to the known good because we have that known library where we can deploy from every time and deploy the right answers. We also want it to be ephemeral. We don't want to commit to anything more often than the other. One of the standard instances you hear for this is you want your servers to be cattle and not pets. You want to have them so that you can change them frequently, that you're not committed to them, that they're not a family friend that stays there for 10 years, but they only stay there as long as you need to, and they move forward. This drives the value of those hard assets closer to zero and puts us on those cloud native applications. This makes attacker persistence hard because we keep changing, and it reduces the concern for our assets being at risk as we move those things forward. With this, I'll mention a standard backup protection is that 3-2-1 metric. If you haven't heard that, you should have 3 sources of backup for any information that you value, any of those crown jewels. You should have them on 2 different media sources, and you should have 1 offline. This helps expedite your business continuity plan as well as your disaster recovery. Of course, being in cloud, a lot of times we distribute it automatically, and that gives us multiple sources of backup. However, it doesn't reduce the need for you to have that offline backup so that you can protect your systems. So how do you start the job? How do you start that security team if you don't have one, if you're moving into these phases? Well, now you've got a bunch of good ideas, but with a new job, where do you start? You start with the project history. Where has the project been before? What have the problems been? What are the retrospectives? Hopefully you have some of that information. If you don't, that's a chance to go back and get it through those focus and sensing sessions, through those metrics that you have. You need to make sure that the right people have access to the right required systems. We talked about having the distributed VMs and having those VMs available to kick off whenever the developer wants. We know that change can create error in these systems, and change in organization creates error as well. If you go back to Conway's Law tells us that our infrastructure is going to reflect our organization. If we have a modular organization, we're going to tend to have a modular infrastructure. If we have a large hierarchical organization, we're going to tend to have more of a top-down infrastructure and something that supports us. We need to be able to recognize how our organization affects our infrastructure and how our infrastructure affects our organization. We want to make small decisions in small increments, going back to the DevOps processes. When we make those small changes, we can better identify the results from them. We can make them down to the simple problems rather than the complex problems and identify how we move changes through. The example on the right shows you a number of the different tests that you may use in the different stages or different security tests that you can use in the different stages of your functions. And you can see that there's a lot. And not only do we have a lot of core level tests, but we can use a lot of tests of a lot of different software, of a lot of different implementations. And each of these implementations creates different answers and different results that we need to drive. We need to try to integrate all that history as much as possible so that we can know how to start our folks. This leads into the factor of your security problem starting off. Do you understand the tools that you're using? Is the security team using the same scanners as the development team? Do they understand the tools? Are they the right tools for their instance? We constantly want to challenge our old models and make sure that they continue to deliver us the right security and the right problems through the metrics we're getting with those assessments. We want to maybe test new tools, talk to the vendors, see what's coming out, and see who's got a good idea. D2IQ is excellent for managing containers-based implementations, looking through those implementations and seeing what's out there. Trello, of course, is a workflow board. If you don't have a workflow, if you don't have a standard way of doing business that you're measuring and making that work observable, you may not have even hit the basic stack. And then, of course, SaltStack, since we mentioned Stack. SaltStack looks through our infrastructure and automatically goes out there and finds our patches and finds our changes that are out there. In addition to these, there's a number of other vendors and systems out there that can help you move forward. Each of these is geared to the same levels, the same requirements of being able to work transparently, being able to create observability across the system so that you can see what you're doing and what others are doing with the systems you move forward. It makes the pipelines visible. Now we can run multiple pipelines, or we might only have one workflow because our pipelines are technical and automated and designed to move us to that continuous integration, continuous delivery. Sources like GitLab, CircleCI, and Jenkins all run pipelines, and they show you what each step is doing, what each test is doing in each step to make sure that the code is configured and the code moves forward. Once we have those pipelines and those results, we can communicate often. We can talk about both the results of the pipeline, how those pipelines contribute to the workflow, and how our workflow supports our pipeline in moving forward to create value for the customer. We also have to make organizational solutions. This can be a tougher point. This can be a much tougher challenge for a lot of people to handle because organizations frequently are slower to change than we change our DevOps process. Our DevOps is a culture and not an organization and not a technical solution. If you've merely bought a DevOps solution and think that that's the answer to your problem, it's not the overall answer. You need to change that organization, that culture in the background to make sure that your organization supports your culture moving forward. You need to have a leadership structure that's committed to building good teams, building cross-functional teams where they have multiple representative skills across those teams, and that we invest in our people. We spend time in training and we spend time in harvesting the process to get the good results from the process, to find the areas and the gaps in training, making sure that we improve people. Much like this webinar today, you take an opportunity to go out there and build skills and build more improvement in the way forward. We integrate our people through leadership. We beat the street and find out what other solutions are out there. We go to conferences like DevOps Days or the All-Day DevOps or other factors, whatever conferences we have locally, whatever training we have available to find out the best options and the best way in the market of getting forward and learning more ideas. DevOps is about sharing, and a lot of these ideas can be shared at that higher level and then can be implemented at the lower level because you can take those ideas and transform them into your team to build the transparency. We need to make sure that our leadership links the items and tasks at every level, that we don't have things that contribute to our development that aren't being characterized, aren't being categorized as we move forward. One of the examples that we frequently fail on this is that we go to develop something, and as we develop it, we need new aspects and new capability. But we don't include that contractual model. We don't include what the finance has to do to support our development moving forward. We've simply run out there and grabbed the new changes without thinking about the next step. I have a great example of this. We were working on a team, and the team was making a decision to switch from Jenkins to a GitLab instance. In that instance, I went out there and talked to a vendor as a security expert. And I talked to the GitLab vendor and saw that they had all these great tools for assessing security. They had all these great built-in metrics that you could use when you use GitLab that would provide you the security answers you were looking for in a rapid and expedient basis. I said, that was awesome. We were going to go to GitLab. So I went back to the head developer and our chief software engineer. I said, this is great. When we move to GitLab, these are some of the things we want. These are some of the things we expect to see. It's going to make security so much easier. And they came back to me and they said, well, yeah, but because of the finance constraints, we only bought the basic model. The basic model doesn't include any of those metrics. That's the importance of talking to each other, the importance of having the integration so that you can plan for those things at the start and get the licenses you need to support you as you move forward, even if it's outside of that normal path. This helps us prioritize our work and find out what we need to do first and what we need to do importantly, and manage the security from one aspect to the other in our organization, as well as in our down at the development process. To discover fixes, our first fix is to adopt a philosophy. We've talked about this a lot throughout, but we have to know that the philosophy that we have supports our security model, that we're committed to security throughout the organization, and we're committed to a full DevSecOps integration. We want to make sure that we build security user stories, that the devs are the users of security, just as much as our customers are users of security, that the devs know why the security is important and how it works together. We see dev user stories where we see security as an enabler. We see security being built in. It's one of those acceptance criteria or one of those definitions of done, that it doesn't make it to the next goal without having security as part of it. That we don't have security as a separate feature that's merely bolted on, but we build it in from the beginning. We also want to make sure that we add that product owner component, right? That the compliance adds value. Compliance adds value to our organization. And without that compliance, we can't be successful in the industry, especially if we're in a highly regulated industry like healthcare or finance, where we have to have those factors at every step in order to make the next change. We want to patch the holes. After moving past identifying the security, we need to identify the risk. We need to manage from those multiple users, find out what the risk of those multiple users is, make sure that all those users are accessing the system similarly, that they're using the same access, the same authentication, the same authorization to go through, so that we don't have people coming through and accessing from a non-approved or non-secure method. We see a lot of times in development that we include some of the codes and some of those secrets as hard-coded because we have multiple developers using the same software. Instead of passing around a password, they merely write the password into the code. As we move from development to test and production, we need to make sure to remove those secrets. And although this seems easy, this is one of those things we have to repeat over and over again because we constantly see that same error. Sometimes we want to avoid suggesting a solution that doesn't have leverage, that we've made a solution or we've said, hey, this is the best way possible to do this thing, but it's not supported. It either doesn't have the contract, doesn't have the license, or doesn't have enough support through the other developers. One development instance has come up with a great solution and a great success, and this is the way they're going to secure it. But the way they've secured it doesn't interact with those other elements of code, those other containers, or the orchestration that we have in place to move forward. Security ultimately looks for long-term success through short-term compliance. We make sure that we meet those lower level goals so that we can move to the next step. As I've suggested, some of those CI/CD runners, such as GitLab, Jenkins, and Circle CI, can help you get to CI/CD. However, merely implementing one of those DevSecOps solutions doesn't mean you have DevSecOps. You need to change the organization and you need to change the culture around it so that you can move forward. One of those things that gets left behind is forgetting to train security. As I mentioned, they implemented GitLab and they didn't include those security options that we wanted. And then we had to go out and get our own training as a security team on what to do for GitLab, on how to use GitLab to view the pipelines, to dig into the data and dig into the metrics so we knew the security functions were out there. We do both security tests and operational tests. We make sure that it works from the security perspective, we make sure that it works from the operational perspective, and we fix all those holes. We patch them one at a time, and we deliver each element that we patch as part of our minimum viable product, part of our next stage to the customer, so we get better and better over time as we move forward. So when you talk to security, when you're starting into patching those holes, what are some of those good questions? Well, these are some of the great questions you can have. One of the examples on the screen is the common vulnerability and exposure graphic. This is a massive index of all the problems that are out there. And frequently, the solutions that the companies and vendors have to fix those problems, they get between several thousand to tens of thousands of these a day and hundreds of thousands over the year. So they are constantly looking at them. We need to know what our own vulnerabilities are. We need to focus on our instance in our pipeline to make sure we know the risks, we know how long the fixes will take, and how security can help us fix it, as well as how the developers can help fix it. Then we need to make sure that we talk about whether the problem is repeated through other instances of our development product. One of those big questions on there is, why should I care and how do we tell? How do we find it? How do we know that we have the right baseline and the right structure where we can build security? And then once we have those features, we need to talk about automation. How do we automate those fixes so that we don't have to fix them every time? That we don't have to spend expensive human time fixing problems when it might be merely an automated solution. When we do that, we can stop it from happening again. We can build ourselves a solid baseline in our discussion, and we can move into the next steps. And the next step is continuous security, a really good mature solution in moving through the DevOps mindset. When we move through that maturity, we talk chaos, definable, repeatable, managed, and optimized. 5 steps. We want to get to optimization. We want to get to optimization through continuous security at every level. This is a great chart from Engineering DevOps by Mark Hornbeek, and it shows you all the different aspects of security you can do at every level. And you see when you focus on one level, there's multiple ways that you can look at the security, and they all have to be integrated. They all have to be put together and work as best as possible because security is everywhere. Security is throughout, and with the unique security tools, you can find different answers and different metrics. And those metrics drive you to where you want to be by helping you eliminate and isolate the smallest problem there. Because our continuous security ultimately addresses our continuous delivery. If we can be sure that we're secure throughout, early in the pipeline, we can be sure that we're secure later in the pipeline and have that continuous delivery. Our fast delivery to our minimum viable product, get the most value into our customers' hands as often as possible. Lean and value stream thinking helps minimize the security waste and minimize our delays in cycle time so that we continue to expedite and make that value and make profit for our customer and deliver what we need, where we need it to be, when we need it to be, and be confident that we are both guarding our product and signaling for a threat. This leads to our processes and outcomes because outcomes are the most important. We're not worried about outputs in DevOps. We're worried about the outcome, what actually comes out of the pipeline. In our flow, we see security-driven development, that we don't neglect security, that security drives us just as much as our test-driven development does. That we drive our security for positive scenarios where we're all good and negative scenarios of what if something happens? And do we need to prepare for it? Is it a significant risk at today's feature that we need to fix it today, or we have some time that we can fix it out later on in the process? Our product and feature teams collaborate with security. They talk frequently. They work together to build those security acceptance criteria throughout, that they know what the stages are and they know what they have to do. Then, of course, the dirty word, we have to establish policies. We have to know that those policies are in place that govern both our legacy codes and our new implementation. Frequently, auditors don't stop at merely the security of the code, but they want to talk about the training of those individuals. How much security have you provided, and how much collaboration do you have? What are all the factors, and what are those hard factors in the organization, as well as in the security? Our feedback then contributes to shifting security left, shortening that feedback loop so that we get the results of those security scans, not merely the fact that the security scan has been run early on in the process. One of the ways we do this feedback is we share the on-call tasks. We make the developers and the operators just as responsible for on-call as the security folks that we call them in. Sometimes we can use a data science model to improve our feedback, to get a sense of how those metrics link together, that we share the threat intel. All these help us get a better pipeline acceptance and make sure that we match those CVEs and we track them throughout our process so we know where the risks are. These factors lead us to continuous experimentation, being able to look for indicators of compromise, being able to do our SIEM, our security information event management, and our indicators of concern. We repeat these practices through our experiment. Sometimes we use hackathons or penetration testing to do continuous learning and continuous experimentation. One of the best ways we have is if you take that infrastructure team that's used to working on one thing and you break them off for a section, break them off for a sprint or an iteration, and say, hey, at this point, I want you to go through our code and go through our processes and find out where there's holes, find out where we have problems. That helps them contribute to the team and builds that trust and credibility throughout that they can use to deliver practices and outcomes. Overall, you're not just about operations. You're not just about the delivery. What you have to be able to do is you have to be able to find balance in your teams. You have to find a balance to integrate development, security, and operations together so that they talk to each other and that they trust each other as they move forward. Shortfalls in your product drive an action, but any action creates an imbalance. When we look at the second law of thermodynamics, we find entropy in a system always increases. To fix that entropy, we have to introduce change. But those changes introduce new problems, new shortfalls that we need to move forward and create a new action. We start with the simple metrics. We start with where we are and what those base rates are. And then we measure change against those base rates so that we can move forward. The balance of our security practices is our journey. It's not an end. As I mentioned, the best maturity level for DevOps is optimizing, that we continuously work through the process and we continue to look for ways to find and improve things and not just be in a static organization. Thank you for your time today. This has been my discussion on integrating your DevSecOps teams. And with that, I'll turn you back over to Ryan for some notes from Good eLearning.
Thank you so much, Mark, and I absolutely agree. Security should be within the CI/CD pipeline. I've had experiences of security being left to the end, and it just led to the project being delayed significantly. So it's always important to have that integrated into the CI/CD pipeline. And to form the basis of that, what we provide at Good eLearning, well, essentially we provide a full suite of DevOps and SRE and even DevSecOps courses as well for you to get the foundations of knowledge to drive your integration of your DevSecOps teams. So what do the products come with? Well, essentially they're fully accessible online through multiple delivery platforms. You get a free reset as well. And also as well, you get practice exams so you can rinse and repeat until you're ready to pass the certification. Just on the next slide, there's essentially some insights into some courses as well that are kind of aligned to the webinar today. So you'll see here that the Good eLearning subject area, mainly DevOps and SRE, where we provide DevSecOps Foundation, DevOps Leader, SRE Foundation, SRE Practitioner. We also provide as well some cybersecurity courses in Resilia, and also some IT service management courses in Certified Agile Service Manager. Also some courses not currently on this document, but we've just recently launched on the portfolio, our CompTIA stack. So we've got CISA, CASP as well for all of your cybersecurity needs. So thanks very much for attending the webinar, and I've got some exciting news for you that you can see on this slide here. So for 1 week only, until the 14th of April, here is your discount code for DevOps and SRE courses. So you can leverage the discount code DevOps40 to get 40% off of Good e-Learning's DevOps and SRE courses. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mark, for the webinar today. And we can't wait for your questions. Hi, everyone. Okay, so please feel free to use the question feature in the Zoom section. So first question is, Mark, how to ensure the design is foolproof?
Hey, so there's a real easy question to that, right? The first one is don't hire fools to write your design for you. However, that's a little bit off the cuff and not really what you want to talk about. The best answer, if you're looking at designs and you really want to make sure you have a design, is have someone kind of take an outside viewpoint of looking at the design. One of the things we talk about is regularly getting into higher penetration testing and using those pen test teams to come back and check what you have. Now, penetration teams can be quite expensive, especially when you get the higher one in. So one way to make use of your current DevSecOps organization in doing those aspects of penetration is taking a section of your ops team or your dev team and assigning them during your innovation time to go through and try to break something that you already have, to find a way to find a new way in, find a new tool, find a new aspect. I just talked to a gentleman the other day, and he said, you know, when you're looking at foolproof and you're looking at these types of things, he had a great schematic he used, and I really liked it, which is why I'm going to repeat it. And he said he took everybody they had in this class and said, I'm going to give you some crayons. And what I want you to do is I want you to spend 10 minutes and pretend like you were in third grade. And I want you to design the most secure house possible. I want you to build that house. I want you, you know, I want alligators, I want moats, I want turrets, I want satellite coverage, whatever you can do to make that house the most secure possible. Then he turned that around and said, okay, now, you know, who has the best demonstration? Who has the best house? And they brought up their house and they started showing the overlapping turret fields and the sensors and the automatic gunners and the, you know, the alligators that were out there in the moat that would catch anybody who was trying to sneak in. They said, okay, now what I want you to think about is that it's a monsoon outside. The rain is literally pouring down. There's thunder and lightning. Your wife pulls up from the grocery store. She's got a full load of groceries she's got into the house. She's got 3 kids screaming. How do you get her into the house? And everybody started, you know, doing that double take. Well, what do I do? How do I check that? And so the answer in saying that you want a foolproof design is really part of that you have to build the best secure design you have that provides the most value to the customer you're expecting to get. That public facing aspect is going to have a whole different design aspects than your internal aspects and the internal data that you need to keep more secure. So you need to find that balance in doing these types of things. And again, that's where that pen testing and having your own folks test against those considerations are most important in moving forward.
So, Mark, what are the 3 most important considerations when setting up DevSecOps for the first time for our DevSecOps Foundation learners?
So I'd back up to some of the organizational and cultural issues, right? Which doesn't seem like a lot, but at its heart, as we've mentioned, DevSecOps is really a cultural feel. So the first one is you have to get that communication. You have to get people that are willing to talk to each other and able to talk to each other. The second step is making sure that management in product management likes to know that they have the time, right? That you have to have the time. Too often we see somebody say, we want to do a DevOps transformation. And what happens is they think they're going to get everything that they plan for in 2 years in 3 months because you've gone to DevOps. Well, the real answer is when we start that team up and we start putting those groups together and letting them talk and letting them kind of find their feel, that forming stage process, right? If we have forming, norming, storming, brainstorming, in exceptionalism. But it really takes 3 months to get the feel for what it is and to get an idea of what those initial metrics look like over about that 3-month period, that 3-month period of development and security in working into your team to get the process. Then at that 6-month point, you can go and verify the baseline. And then 6 months past that is where you really start improving. Now, you might see some velocity improvements and some time changes early on in that process, but they're not really going to hit until you hit about that 6 month point. So management, when they say, hey, we're going to DevSecOps as a transformation, they have to be willing to wait. They have to be patient and not be sticking their fingers in all the time about why things aren't being delivered, or what rate they're being delivered, or how they're being delivered. But the third most important, again, goes back to culture, that we really have to be blame-free when we set this up. We can't be the dev team and the security team and just that security other. Like I mentioned, a security champion or a security representative, somebody who goes down to the teams, who sits with those folks on a day-to-day basis and has those discussions. And it's really blame-free. It can't be, the developers aren't doing this. If they'd only do that, our security would be perfect. And the developers saying, we can't deliver because security is sitting there. They're telling us that we have to do this before we hit the next step. So you have to have some kind of balance between those three. So communication, patience, and then I guess it was communication again, but the representation, right? The credibility between the teams of being able to know that you can trust each other, that you can depend on each other moving forward.
Okay, and so moving on to essentially cybersecurity SMEs being essentially a scarce resource. You've mentioned kind of upskilling during the webinar. So assuming security SMEs are a scarce resource in an organization, how can we bring them to the action most effectively? And that aligns to the previous question as to you may have a scarce resource of SMEs. They're trying to bring in DevSecOps to organizations that mainly being in devs and ops. And so how do they integrate that accordingly?
Well, so security folks are absolutely scarce, right? It's like 100 operators for 10 devs for one security guy, or 100 devs for 10 operators. So there's some frequency in there that they look at it, and that we don't have a lot of that security expertise. So we do have to get the representation and make them a part of that team. But we have to value that effort for our security folks to go down to the teams as well. We have to say this is a valuable piece of the process, that we have these folks engaged. And that their time is spent, that they're not, it's not seen as an extra or as an additional, but as a core part of what they do to bring those communications together, both with the development teams and the operational teams, right? Too often we get the operational teams who sit in the metrics they're using don't match what we need for security or what we need to make the program more valuable. An example, you have an analyst sitting there or an operator sitting there, and their metric is you have to answer 180 help tickets a day. And they're just looking at knocking out those help tickets. They don't really care how it applies to anything else, or what maybe the impact of some of those larger changes is on the other pieces. But if they're talking regularly to the security folks, then they can get that information and they can get that development. As I mentioned, one of the things that's most valuable for that security person is to find a security guy in your organization who's interested in still learning the code, who's interested in understanding what the technical application is, more than just the policy application of what they've been doing with GDPR to build to make sure that we're doing the audit and the compliance correctly. On some of the other talks I give, I talk about what audit is. When you walk into a test, when you walk into an academic course, a lot of times you don't know what's going to be on the test. You're given a huge range of material. You're asked to learn as much as you can, and then you get the test, and the test asks for some particular aspect of that thing. That doesn't happen in audit and security. You get the test beforehand. Everybody who's going into an audit knows exactly what the questions are going to ask, how those questions are going to be portrayed, what they expect to see for an answer, what the results are going to be. Now, sometimes you get a difference in auditors where they're not used to seeing security in a particular way, or they're not as familiar with the technical things. And that's where it really becomes your security rep's view, if they've been on that team, to be able to present the information in a way that helps everybody. Another good example, I was working with a security team, and because we had folks integrated, when we built up our answers to audit, instead of just having the policy they expected in the scan result, we also showed them where it was in code that we verified it. We had copies of how it actually ran. We could show them videos of somebody logging in with one attempt and not doing it, logging in with something else, and getting a different set of answers. So in addition to just that written thing that they were expecting, we had videos, and we had code demonstration, and we had this whole schema that we could put together because our security teams had been integrated all the way along, because our security folks have been integrated all the way along. So that helps. I mean, obviously, like the last part of the question is, does it depend on your business type, size, and industry? Well, yes, because as we've done the risk, we've managed the risks that are most appropriate to our size of industry. But you can do all those same things that prevent the thieves from getting into your organization by following the standard patterns, by following the standard security lockdowns, by securing your routers, by securing your gateways, by making it easy for the customer, but difficult for someone who wants to get beyond that public-facing aspect to move to the next step.
And I think as well, what I've seen is that cybersecurity is for everyone. Everyone needs to kind of take some sort of interest in it, because if you're all making little steps to improve your cybersecurity, then it's improving the cybersecurity as a whole as well. We've got here like a team building kind of question that aligns with cloud solutions. So if a team is building and running a whole cloud solution top to bottom, how can we ensure that they have the right breadth of security knowledge across AppSec and infra? This person is essentially interested in where to start.
So there's all kinds of places where to start. I just talked to a gentleman the other day who was interested in building more security people, and how do we get more security people? How do I get people into junior security positions? And one of the challenges is there's not really a junior security position, because when those people come into these agile organizations, they're moving so fast that I want them to have the coding knowledge, that I want them to understand what's going on behind those security decisions you're asking them to make. So if you're looking at cloud, if you're looking at any of these larger type, highly technical organizations, you need to look at the skill set and make sure that you're allowing time for those individuals to do training on those things and to learn more and build an instance where they can get the crosstalk, get that cross communication going and collaboration about what comes forward. Usually when you build a team, you have people who are fairly general across a number of skills, and you have one or two guys or one or two individuals who are experts in another area. So taking the time to do like the lunch and learn, sitting those down and saying, we're going to talk about a particular container application, or we're going to talk about a new vulnerability that's going to come out and how we explore against this vulnerability. Or we're going to talk about, not even from the security side, we're going to talk about using the company repo and why this, repo is secure and how you use the repo. And it seems like basic stuff, but if you commit to doing that training all the time, it becomes an embedded process, part of your process and part of the way you move forward. We saw, I think Google does, that they spend 4 to 6 hours out of every week telling their folks they should commit to innovation and training during that time. And they don't want to see any work or any progress on the things they have in the pipeline moving forward. What they want to see during that time is there are people focusing on new skills and new abilities and learning in a new way about what comes forward. And of course, webinars like this are a key part of that success, right? Learning and getting a new variation, a new version of what's out there, knowing that you're staying at the leading edge of the industry.
Absolutely, as well as the e-learning, the virtual classrooms as well, to kind of set those foundations of knowledge in new areas, as well as in areas that you're familiar with as well. So does the starting point depend on your business? So type, size, industry. If you're a smaller business, do you need to implement DevSecOps in a different way? To a larger business, of course, there may be different nuances involved with implementation.
Well, yes. I mean, that's the Conway's law, right? Every business and every organization is different, and you need to build something that makes the value for you. Now, when you say implement DevSecOps, when I talk about it, I talk about the cultural aspect. So there's no different way that I implement how to do flow feedback and continuous learning. I just, start enforcing it and start working with those things and commit to those things as a cultural change. The technical solutions are obviously going to be very different as you move from level to level, to step, and look at things, but they shouldn't change the way in which you approach the problem. And it's that basic mindset that lets you approach the problem in a different way that helps get you to the solution. And remember, the DevOps is a journey, not a destination. So it's something we continuously do to get to the right place.
Absolutely. And so the last question here, as we're running to the top of the hour and just got the little bits and pieces to finish off the session. So could you talk more about discussion topics such as vulnerability management, application and cloud security, and the best approaches to leverage DevSecOps to enhance these topics? Of course, this could be another webinar topic, but just just a couple of comments would be really, really handy.
Or 3, right? Or 4, or Vulnerability management is challenging. We constantly have to do it. We constantly have to look at the vulnerability. We have to use the scanners that are out there to find the vulnerabilities we have in place, and then make sure that we have the infrastructure and the ops to patch those vulnerabilities in a regular amount of time. Application cloud security are still vulnerability, looking at security from a different aspect, as well as looking at the measurement and the communication. How do our different things talk to each other? As we kind of touched on a little bit, the public facing aspect of your website or your business versus the private facing organization. Talk to some folks in the financial industry. They have a different platform team that builds internally for what they develop on versus the one that actually goes out to the customers. And they have the same issue that a lot of people do. They don't value their platform until it actually slows down the development on the other side. So when the guys are planning for something that comes out a year in advance, that's going to make the platform better, to make development easier, they don't get any priority, they don't get any funding until it gets to a year later. And now the development slowed down because they haven't improved the platform. And now they're trying to make readjustments, right? So we've got to be able to integrate all those things together as we move forward. And the best approach to leverage DevSecOps, get out, do the webinars, do the training, and then just start talking about it. Talk about it with your teams, talk about it with your management, talk about it with people, and get other people excited in the possibility of doing it. Because one of the real things with Agile and DevOps is we're looking for no heroes, right? We're trying to build a common cross-functional team so that everybody gets to go in and work their 8 hours and go home. That we don't have 12 or 16 or 24 hours spent trying to push a new release out, trying to fix something that's come out there, where we're all in crisis mode with our hair on fire, but we're just doing the right things and talking to each other all the time so that life gets easier for everybody.
Absolutely. And so on that, to establish your foundation of knowledge, if you're just moving into DevSecOps or the DevOps world, Goody Learning do a full suite of DevOps Institute courses. As mentioned, until the 14th of April, you've got 40% off the suite of DevOps and SRE courses. So have a look at the portfolio on www.goodylearning.com. And that's it from me. And I would love to say a very special thank you to Mark for the webinar today, and have a great day and a great week, everyone who attended. Thank you so much.